problem clicking through the slides for you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for doing that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And we'll need another note taker for this meeting since Sean won't be here. So if anyone would be willing to take notes for this session, it would be appreciated.
Should we go ahead and start? There's nobody there. I can't really tell.
I might give it another few minutes since we're coming back from lunch, just to, 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay, sounds good. We have plenty of time.
And DKG is volunteered to take notes for this second part. You don't need to maintain any continuity, really. Like, it'll just only really capture what's said at the mic.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
You just want to get into it?
We can.
All right. Well, maybe we should get started. It doesn't look like we're going to have anyone else come in. So whenever you're ready, Cheers.
Okay, picking up where we left off. Go ahead, Femi.
Yeah. Do you mind just using the most recent slide? I kind of fixed the comment Alyssa made previously, if that's okay. Thank you.
So this is the only version we have in the, at least in Meet Echo. There might be a newer one on the data tracker.
Okay. You don't have the latest. Okay. We can use this. Okay. Yeah, I think a few more people.
Oh, I guess a few more people are coming in.
Okay.
Do you want to take Eric's question now, or?
Yeah. We'll stay on the first requirement, number 1. Eric, do you have a, because we just continue from the prior session, so maybe as a comment. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so I want to make 2 points about this first bullet. I think first is hopefully uncontroversial, which is that I'm not sure the recipient versus sender is the right phrasing here. And what I mean by that is that suppose that I get a message that I have a CSI, and I get a message from somebody and they claim to have a different CSI. I think John sees where I'm going with this. How do I resolve the different MSP which is entitled to that CSI? And you may say, well, you don't care about that, but the next thing I know, but say I want to type in, their phone number in some other system. And so I really would like to have origin authentication, not just destination authentication. So I may just pause there because that was a simpler, less controversial point.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
I mean, and this is John. I mean, obviously you're right. And I mean, to me, if the two properties are not the same, if the way that we prove those is not the same, we're doing something wrong.
I agree.
Which is why I keep saying we need to bring the Mimi identity draft back and like turn that into the thing where that is going to live. That's going to explain how you make the sending and receiving of this work the same way.
Agreed. So hopefully
Yeah.
I'm just nitpicking about the phrasing of this one. All right, right now.
Yes. I agree that recipient there, even Alyssa was saying this, I think before the break, is a little misleading. So yeah, we need to
Yeah.
wordsmith that a bit. So what's your second point though? Now I'm scared.
Yeah, the more controversial one, right? Which is that the security property which this implies is that if you were a large MSP, you can impersonate anyone with any CSI that is attached to your MSP to anyone else. And that may or may not be, that seems like a fairly undesirable property, but maybe not one we can get past.
Yeah, and I too was kind of picking at this wording. So I mean, you've seen the ID prover thing, the three-way handshake thing that I have here, right? Like that is designed to provide the property that will prevent that. And we need to find a way to phrase this requirement that captures that, right?
Right. So I think, you know, I can imagine a number of different ways to capture this. Like
Sure.
one could say, for instance, that the discovery system only provides this mapping, and there's a second system which establishes that you own the CSI. But somehow, I think the system in total ought not to allow this, ought to allow the security property.
Yes,
I just laid out.
So
Remember,
I started using this term ID prover, and I don't care how we implement the ID prover, but the ID prover's job is to generate authenticated mappings, and you know, relying parties trust ID provers to do what they say they're doing. That's my pitch anyway.
Sounds like we're on the same page about what ought to happen, whether we're on that, and then we have to try and encode that in some text here.
Yeah, thank you both.
Maybe
I know.
on the same page.
Thank you both. Remember, we are still in requirement. We are not talking about design. We are not talking about. We just want to be sure that everyone is kind of pleased with this. We know this will lead to a lot of conversation during design.
But
who is this on the
Ecker
line?
is saying he's not pleased with the wording of this because the wording is not prescriptive enough. We don't want to build the solution into the requirement, but as he reads this requirement, he reads it like any MSP can just choose to impersonate like whatever CSI they feel like, right? And so
that is not the intention.
We need to, so we may need to wordsmith a bit. Let's not take that away from what Ecker said.
Yeah. Who has this on the line? Conrad.
Hi, just a quick question because I'm not sure and follow entirely based on the first conversation. So who is the recipient here? So because my impression was that someone goes and tries to get this mapping to obtain the server specific identifier and then goes kind of do a MIMI kind of service internal kind of discovery stuff. So this is just about the mapping. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the person, so my understanding is that the person who is actually holding this discovered identifier, they're not actually involved, right?
No, they're not involved yet. Yeah.
So then we're just talking about a sender and a recipient. Who are those two?
Okay, so can we, let me go back one more slide. I think it's fair for us to go over the row one more time. Do you mind just skipping back one slide, Tim? Oh, I think one more. This one. Okay, so this is a good refresher. So, so recipient, this is the holder of the CSI, right? I have this telephone number, it's my telephone number, I receive calls on it. So that's the recipient. And I want to allow other people to determine what messaging service they can use to reach me. What do I need to do? Then I create this mapping. So all we've been talking about recipient requirement is about creating that mapping to help.
So these are all preconditions for communication. These don't actually have, these are things that happen before you send or receive anything, right?
That's right.
That we're talking about now.
Yeah, okay, that clarifies it. All right, thank Tim. Can we go back? Okay, so number one, I think the main idea is clear. We just want to ensure that the holder of the CSI is the one that authorizes the creation of that verifiable mapping. That's all.
I'm sorry to be difficult, but unfortunately, the problem is the phrase mapping of a CSI to an MSP is the difficulty here, right? Namely, is the mapping from a CSI to an MSP, or is it mapping from a CSI to MSP SSP pair? And if it's not to an MSP SSP pair, then what provides the mapping from the CSI to the SSP? That's the relevant question. And maybe that's not a mapping, maybe it's a proof. So like, here's one possibility. You could say, this just publishes like I am on WhatsApp. And then when you finally get to WhatsApp, you have the guys to demonstrate to you that he has a thing. So that would be a fine set of properties. I just want to make sure that we agree that like end to end, at the very end of the day, when I finally call John, he proves he's John, not some other clown on WhatsApp. That's the thing we want to have, right?
Yeah. I mean, and all this text is weasel-wordy about this precisely because like iCloud is opaque to the external world, and whatever internal identifier is being utilized there, it's never like you can possess that SSI that will get you to route like to me on iMessage. And so that's why we phrase this like the mapping is actually between the CSI and the MSP.
So
And what happens after that
right.
could be an SSI, might not.
So maybe if we just have explanatory text that was underneath that was non-normative to explain that we expect that to provide some other way, that'd be fine.
Yeah, it is not SSI. It should be concerning if it's SSI. Okay. Any other comment about this number one? We're really going very slowly to be sure that everyone thinks it's good. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was on the notes page and I couldn't get to the queue.
That's fine. Go.
Thanks.
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. This is just wordsmithing, but that only is very unclear what it applies to. Is it the recipient must only verifiably authorize it, or that it's the recipient that's the only? Like, what is the only attached to there?
The only one means that only me should authorize the creation of that mapping.
Right. So you should write it as must, like only the recipient must be authorized or something.
Okay,
it's a wordsmithing thing. I don't know.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for bringing it out. Okay. Any other comment before we move on from one? Number two, a mapping must permit the recipient to include a tag that expresses how the recipient wants that mapping to be utilized. So tag is very open-ended. The design will figure out what that should look like. But we just want to say, when I create the mapping, I should be able to say, when you get this mapping, this is how you should use it. For example, all personal communication, you should send it through WhatsApp. But if it's related to my business, I want you to use Wire, for example. So the recipient should be able to express that preference so that when the sender eventually gets this mapping, it will be able to respect those preferences. Any comment on this? Number two, only. Okay.
So thumbs up in the back of the room.
All right, thanks. Okay, so we move on to number three. So in the real world, we know telephone number get reassigned, and each CISP has its own process. For telephone number specifically, the phone number might need to be aged out for some period where it's not assigned to anybody. Eventually, will get reissued to a different user. Now, assuming the prior owner already establishes mappings for that telephone number, and then a new user comes in, he also establishes a different set of mapping, then you now have a situation where you have mapping that are owned by two different identities, which is very confusing. So for that reason, we need to be able to allow mappings to be removed by the user that has the telephone number, the current holder of that CSI. Alternatively, for scenario whereby for some reason the CISP want to be involved, you just want to make sure I want to issue our only clean phone number, they should be able to authorize deletion of any existing mapping for a CSI. That's this requirement. Or for any reason the user wants to restart all over, maybe it's clear out existing mapping and recreate new one. The user can do that. Okay, let's go to the line. Herald.
Harald Alderström.
Hi.
The confusing case for me is the case where the SSI, I think I got it right, the provider of the endpoint service has a reason to reassign his ID. Because under the rule as stated, if he reassigns his ID and the CSI on a CSI IP and the end user don't care or don't like it, you will have mappings that are pointing to an identifier that is not valid for the end user. And I think that's a case where the authorization to remove should exist for someone other than the people giving here.
That's a very valid point. Yeah, I agree. Eric?
Yeah, I think the more general question is, should the MSP be involved? Should the MSP's approval be required to publish the initial mapping, right? And I think you can make the argument either way. I think, as I said in my email, one possibility is you could say, well, gee, anyone can always say that, like, I'm on WhatsApp, but when you finally get there, you get a no, so it doesn't really matter. Or you can say, well, I don't really want people saying they're on WhatsApp when they're not on WhatsApp. But I think that 1 and 3 are intertwined in this respect, right? So it would be a little odd to say. It'd be a little odd to say, well, I can publish that that my phone number is on WhatsApp, but then WhatsApp I can take it off, but they're not required to help me publish it. That seems like a somewhat odd asymmetry.
Yeah, that's a valid point. I think we talked about this a little bit. So, yeah. So, I mean, if we require the MSP to be involved in creating mapping, we are saying that any mapping that the sender gets eventually, he will know that, okay, I can reach this user in this 3 MSP. That is the truth, because each of the MSP kind of confirm that mapping user is reachable on that MSP. On the other hand, the user may lie and say, I'm in these 10 different MSPs and might only actually be in 1 or 2 of those or none of those. And then we have this database of discovery full of incorrect values and things like that. So we just have to decide what is the right thing. On one hand, if we require MSP involvement, it makes the mapping creation process a little bit more challenging to do. We now do a multi-party protocol to kind of establish the mapping. However, if we don't require the MSP to kind of be involved, that means the user can independently create that mapping just solo and then just post. It makes creation easier, but of course, we know what it is. Yeah, John?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think we're really good at, I think we have a good idea of how to make mappings and a less good idea of how to remove them, in the sense of, again, remember, it's not that like if the CSIP owns these mappings or the MSP owns these mappings. They live in this logical discovery provider service that we've defined. And the removing would presumably mean getting them out of those databases, of which there may be many, right? It may be that MSPs operate them. It may be that third parties operate them. And so, I look at this like it's a much more general, it's almost a CRL-ish problem or a short-lived expiry problem where, these mappings, because inevitably these mappings, especially for telephone numbers, there's going to have to be some kind of freshness mechanism for them. It's going to validate that they're still good over time. And, it could be that these mappings will be scoped to an expiry that is based on what we think the necessary freshness interval is for them or something. And I think, that would be a deeper set of requirements we're exploring here today. But, I think casting it like, either the MSP or the CSIP is the police who can go to a discovery provider and say, hey, remove this mapping, is a little perilous, because I don't think that's the situation, right? Like, because the CSIP may know when a CSI gets reassigned, but like, that does not imply that the CSIP had any involvement in the generation of the mapping, because they surely didn't. even, it's going to be either that the user did, the controller or the owner of the CSI did, or the user and the MSP did. And so I'm a little uncomfortable. I mean, I'm okay because of course the CSIP should theoretically be able to say these mappings should be removed. It's just, I don't really see why the CSIP would have any awareness that discovery providers exist, or needs to know that in order to, make mappings go away. So this one too, I think we might need to do a little work on this third one.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one discussion that we went through in Vancouver is a scenario whereby for a user that just got issued a new telephone number and you want to establish a mapping for that number, I mean, it's kind of on you to say, this is the first mapping I'm making, and then it can trigger broadcasts of the deletion broadcasts to other discovery provider to kind of remove that entry because this is the first one. Yeah, so I mean, there are many ways to kind of approach this, but yeah. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess maybe the logical question here is, do we think that it should be that there should be a mechanism which means that you do not do we think that that recipients, I guess in this case, should be able to embed mappings to providers that do not have accounts with, and have that be a permanent status, right? And I think there's a reasonable argument, I suppose, in both ways. We have designs that have that property, mail forwarding as a property. You don't need consent from the recipient; things just go there. But there are also systems that don't allow that. And so I think the question is, do we think that is a property we'd like to have, or not like to have? And if we want to have it, then we don't need anything, because we don't need the MSP's consent to make mappings. They won't be allowed to remove them. If we do not want to have it, then we need to either decide whether we should require the MSP to be involved in making the mappings, or merely they should be able to remove them later. So I can imagine a bunch of possibilities here. But I think we have to decide what the policy we're attempting to enact is. Daniel, I suspect you have some thoughts too.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
This is Daniel Gilmore. I don't actually have thoughts on what Eric just said. I was just thinking about, Femi, your proposal that when a new phone number is allocated, that there would be a broadcast message to all the mapping providers. And that seems to assume that there is a well-known global set of mapping providers. And I'm like, is that part of the architectural plan here?
We are seeing requirement. We don't really know what this will look like. I'm kind of hesitant to kind of make that assumption because there's no architecture that is defined for this yet. So we are at the requirement stage. I'm just mentioning that as a possibility. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that seems like that's quite a significant requirement to say that if a CSIP needs to know automatically about every mapping provider that could be out there in order to possibly do the broadcast, and that makes actual federation, dynamic federation harder.
Yeah, we don't even know if there's going to be a federation. Yeah.
Well, we hope there's federation, because
we don't know. We can't do that.
What's the goal for MIMI here? The goal is federated interoperability, right?
Yeah, but for requirement, the understanding is a single holder could hold all the mapping, a single entity, and it's a possibility. I'm not saying that's how we are going. So the requirement should be agnostic to the architecture that this eventually follow. So we're just trying to stay very high level and not go into any of the specifics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to go a little higher on that, I mean, again, I don't think the CSIP even needs to be involved in the generation of mappings for this to work. And if they do, we probably have a problem, because there are plenty of people who issue, or CSIPs who issue CSIs that aren't thrilled about over-the-top services being used for their CSIs for messaging, because they'd much rather kind of defend that. And so, I mean, definitely as well, like the discovery provider logical service may be highly centralized or highly distributed, like MSPs may run them. So the process both of provisioning them and potentially to the third requirement of removing them really is kind of out of scope, I think, of the way that we're defining this. in that, yeah, it could be some logical federation policy that determines to whom your mappings get propagated when a mapping is created per step one. And like, you know, maybe that same process is the way that these get removed at such a time as they need to get removed. But, you know, just focus on the fact that like neither a CSIP nor an MSP is actually a discovery provider logically. Discovery provider, the thing you, the oracle you go ask for mappings is logically segregated from like both of those entities. And so that's why I'm kind of poking on, well, should the CSIP be required to be like the cop who watches every discovery provider and says like, oh, this mapping is bad, you got to get rid of it, which I kind of think this wording implies they might. I don't
Yeah.
think we want or need them to be involved.
Yeah. So, but I do think we absolutely need to provide a way for a mapping to be changed, right? For example, I have previously I'm reachable on a particular messaging provider, and for some reason I want to discontinue that relationship. I should be able to update the mapping I made previously to not reflect that, to reflect that fact, right? So it just, I think it's a core requirement that we have to have for update or removal, however we want to call it. Daniel? Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe you are not.
I'll kick you.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, I'm starting to be a little concerned about the part of the discussion we're having that actually seems a little different from the part about publishing. This is the issue DKG raised, which is like, do we like whether it's centralized or federated? It seems like the system has to provide a globally consistent view of like the mapping table, right? Does anybody think that's wrong? Eventually, globally consistent.
Trying to put myself in
Right.
queue
Say
responsibly.
your name.
So again, this comes down to a lot of things like that federation question. So you'd easily imagine a federation saying this set of mappings is valid for us, but I can't. These mappings are not available to people outside of our federation.
Fair enough.
Or for geopolitical reasons, we're not allowed to expose this mapping like in Europe, or
Fair
like
enough.
there's like all kinds of things like
Fair
that that will lead this to only being loosely consistent, right?
Fair enough. Let me try to make a weaker requirement then, which is for any sender recipient pair, you should have a consistent view of the system.
Probably.
So I guess here's the thing I'm trying to push on, right? About this is about, it goes back to GKG's question, like the revocation kind of story, right? Is, you know, if you think that I think his concern, if I understood correctly, was I'm going to publish my mappings, and then, you know, someone's going to try to revoke them, and then those go to a different set of people, and now we have an inconsistent view of the universe, right? But that seems like kind of like, but that seems like a pretty surprise problem, you know. In general, if you think that kind of inconsistency is allowed, then I'm worried about the consistency of the forward mapping in the first place without any kind of revocation. So I think with this, I think actually some underlying assumption that, you know, that at least like republication by the same person is like this, like there's the same set of people. Those kinds of consistency requirements have to work. Otherwise, we're going to have all kinds of weird problems about like functionality, right?
Yeah, I mean, probably we need to. I mean, I would almost group that more under what the discovery provider requirements are than the recipient requirements, in the sense.
Fair
of,
enough. I'm happy to push
like,
that off if we want.
So let's look at the discovery provider
Sounds good.
requirements and see if there's something there that should be jammed into.
We'll get there. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on this? Okay. Next slide, please. Sender requirements. So this is the entity that wants to look up how I can reach a recipient, or what messaging service I can use to reach a recipient. So we only have two here. So during discovery, we're saying that a sender, that's number 4, must be able to retrieve all of the verifiable mappings that exist for a given CSI. That means I have a CSI, I should be able to get in response all the mappings that exist for that CSI. Now, this is also look at the word retrieve all. Retrieve all also implies if the mappings is kind of held by a single entity, it's kind of trivial to expect that entity to return all the mapping. However, if the mapping is in a distributed context where multiple discovery provider kind of hold fractions of the database, fulfilling that whole requirement kind of becomes challenging. I mean, you need to federate requests across. If there are 20 such groups, should I wait for the 20 to respond for each query, or I can only get only a subset of 5 and then that is good enough? So it becomes a lot more challenging. So what are people leaning on? Do we require retrieve all, or it should retrieve something? The flip side of this is, if we say it should retrieve a mapping, we might run into a situation where provider might want to do the least amount of work to get the minimum amount of mapping to you and not really be exhaustive in the work they do. So there are two extremes to this. So what do people think about number 4? Comments? Conrad?
Just to understand, would a system, and we talked about this, I think, that where it's a clear, where we have a clear mapping from a given identifier, like a CSI to the CSIP, wouldn't it then be enough to just ask the corresponding CSIP to get all the mappings because that's the authoritative CSIP for the CSI? That seems to be a relatively easy way of doing that, even in a federated system. Or am I misunderstanding something?
Yeah, so the mapping, we don't know how the design will look like.
Sure.
So one possible approach is to say, this is a CSI, and then it can map to an MSP set. All of this is just a single mapping.
Mm-hmm.
And records of this mapping is kind of held with a discovery provider.
Mm.
So as a sender, you say you have a CSI you would like to look up, my telephone number, and then you query based on that, and then you get a mapping, or if there could be multiple mappings, and for each of those mappings there might be sets of MSP that are reachable, or you might have one mapping with its provider, you have a different type with a different provider. There are just so many variability.
Sure. I'm just not sure how the all is that unrealistic to achieve. That's what I was trying.
You think it's not realistic?
No, I think it is realistic.
It's realistic? Okay.
You seem to suggest that it wasn't. So I was trying to understand, well, why not? If we have this clear kind of structure of having some authority for a specific, clearly assigned authority for a specific CSI.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Any other comments on number 4? Okay, all is good. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move on to the number 5. So the main idea of this is any mapping that is the verifiable mapping must include a means for senders to verify they are authentic. It could be some signature. I'm not seeing signature, for example, and when you receive it, you can check it to be sure the public key of the CSIO, that is the one that the private key signs the message, and you can verify that. So that's what this requirement is about. Sounds good? Tim?
Is this requirement satisfied if there has to be an online interaction with the CSIP to verify the authenticity of a mapping?
Because So far, we don't think the CSIP needs to be involved in creating the mapping. It just needs to be able to assert that, yeah, I think it doesn't need to be involved. It's the one that issues the phone number. Other than that, it doesn't need to be involved in this. But this is a different thing. It's like saying I have a mapping that John, for example, says this is my mapping. How do I know actually it's John that created this mapping and not somebody else trying to impersonate John? So I could be able to check that actually the mapping is authentic. John is the person that created the mapping. Yeah, that's what this is about. I don't know if I answer your question.
I have a follow-up, but I'll let John speak first.
Yeah, let me try. So I think the answer to your question is yes, strictly speaking, it could be satisfied by that interaction. We would probably discourage that in virtually all cases, but there are some where it actually makes sense. Those would be cases like, for example, where your CSIP, because you have a telephone number, is actually your provider for like RCS or something like that. And so in that case, I could imagine actually a real-time interaction with that being part of the validity of it. But in almost all cases, we want these mappings to be generated, pre-call. These, again, almost all of the requirements we're doing here are things that are happening before the call is actually placed. And that I look at that as more, generating mappings is more of an enrollment function. And what this requirement means to me, or what I think it's trying to say, is that there should be some cryptography that a sender can actually validate while looking at a mapping to determine its authenticity, to determine that the MSP and in fact the owner of the CSI, the consumer that's the owner of the CSI, attested to this and that it is valid. That's really the purpose of this, and where that really belongs under sender requirements in the sense of senders must, mappings must include the means for sender to do this. There's really a requirement in the mappings, not in the sender. Right. This is, again, just a general requirement about mappings actually have to have some crypto that has the right parties attesting in it that lets you trust that the mappings are valid.
Yep.
Okay. So we would like it to be the case that you have this independent object. Sorry, not you. We would like it to be the case that a sender receives this sort of self-contained object of a mapping that they can verify some cryptography on and go, okay, this is legit, without having to make RPCs to somebody else. However, because of some, I guess we can't really call them edge cases, but because of some extant cases, we can't actually state that explicitly in the requirement.
No, we can't state that you must. We can't state you must use that, but I think we can say that the mappings must include the means, right?
Sure. Yeah. If nothing else, a pointer to the CSIP that you would go ask or something, right?
I mean, I do think it's an edge case, frankly, and the vast majority of the cases that are interesting to us here do not have that property. That where the CSIP is actually our MSP. Those are extremely rare. But so I wouldn't want to write anything that excluded that possibility, though.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. Someone else on the queue? Daniel? Okay. Thanks for that. I think that is it for the sender requirement. So this is staying at a very high level. We are not prescriptive. We are not saying you must use signature. We are just saying I need to be able to check that this mapping is actually legit. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the first three set of requirements for the discovery provider. Remember, this is the entity that aggregates multiple mappings and can provide lookup services to senders. So number 6, we're saying mapping discovery for a given CSI, it must allow cases where there are none, one, or multiple results. Sounds reasonable? Okay.
So I think so, but I want to make sure I understand what what this means. When you say 0, is the case that are you thinking I have published there are no mappings from my CSI to MSP, or are you thinking that that the DP just has no records here?
Maybe there are no records. I mean, it could mean multiple things. It could mean this is a phone number that the holder of that phone number never created any mapping. So when you look it up, it's empty. Or it might be a case whereby the holder of the phone number creates a mapping, but there is no MSP, maybe explicitly to make a statement that I don't want to be reached on any messaging service.
Right.
Like a dummy mapping. Yeah. So that is also a possibility.
Right. I guess what I'm getting at is these are actually functionally different, right? Namely, and DKG saying this in the chat too, right? So in DNS, we talk about like, there's DNS that has the idea of verifiable deniability of existence of a name, and that's different from. And so my point is that it's not clear to me you'll be able to meet. I mean, you have a cryptographic mechanism which proves that the CSP, said don't try to call me. You can't call me anywhere, right? So, the whole of the CSI, but like the DP can always just remove like any record it wants, and we're not going to have a mechanism that guarantees that every name has to be covered by signature like DNS does. And so, if the property, I guess I'm just trying to get at the property here is there's not going to be a way to demonstrate that the DP isn't censoring you, right?
I see.
Which
Yeah.
I think is just inherent, but I just want to like make sure we pull that out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So that if the DP misbehave and kind of exclude certain mapping for a CSI.
I don't see how we stopped. I don't say we stopped that with a very different DP design than the kind we've been thinking about. Like I say, I think, and that comes from the point John was making earlier, which is the CSIPs aren't really that excited about this whole plan, because if they were, then they could cover like every record, right? But the fact they're not means that's what makes it work in DNS. But we don't have the situation here.
Okay, thanks for your comment.
Parallel this, John. And in the case where some identifier belongs to someone who has died, I definitely want to publish that this identifier refers to someone who cannot be reached anymore. So I'd like to have 0, 1, multiple, or no mapping exist as for different cases.
I see. Thanks for that comment. I think that's a good one. Yeah.
Well, yes and no. To Eric's point, we're not going to make NSEC 3 records for this, right? Like, and what that actually implies, I mean, the reason why I'm getting up and being like, I don't know. Unfortunately as well, CSIs are often not things you actually own. In other words, that CSI belongs to your government, and you're like, they give it to a carrier, and that carrier like leases it to you on a monthly basis. And if you stop paying your bill, they take it away, and they get the chance to allocate it to whoever they want afterwards. And so in a case where, so Harold is saying, just proxying for you over the microphone, that there could be a case where the owner of a CSI really wants to publish saying that the owner of the CSI can no longer be reached, right? And maybe that is their survivors that are doing that, or whatever the case may be for that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that is more applicable to email addresses.
Might be, but
not the telephone number.
I can imagine a specialty mapping we could have for that purpose, right? Like, I imagine a mapping that is just kind of dev null, with the intention of saying this person is like literally unreachable, but that gives me a whole bunch of worries just for how that could be misused as well. I think we'd need to work on what the requirement for that actually is, because that's a kind of gnarly one.
Any other comments? Team?
Yeah. Okay. So the problem statement is somebody like some mapping that is no longer valid because, for example, the person is deceased. But I wonder if that particular case can be then punted to the MSP in the sense that what we're talking about here, right, is a discovery mechanism, but enables interoperability such that you translate from, I'm going to get the acronyms wrong, the independent identifier to the like service specific one. All right, so if you establish that routing and then you send the message, and then the MSP can then like send you back some message that says, hey, user so-and-so is no longer reachable because of like so-and-so reason. I wonder if that solves that use case without burdening the interop discovery stack with like that case.
Yeah, I like that. I agree. Yeah. Does that answer your concern? Yeah. Thanks for that. Okay. Let's go to number 7. So this one is the meat of the requirement for privacy. So let's take our time on this one. I will let's discuss it exhaustively. We kind of think that this level of requirement, even though it's very high level, it captures the essence of what we want to do for discovery. So what we're saying is that each time I look up a CSI for another person, I'm kind of creating an edge in the social graph. I'm basically saying I look up John CSI, oh, maybe Femi and John, they are kind of doing something together. So it's kind of growing that social graph. So we need to protect that. Now, in the current discovery that is kind of siloed per provider, I can do the lookup and that social graph is kind of siloed to that provider. But with MIMI interoperability across many messaging provider, that means the new social graph now is like everybody across provider. So the privacy concern is much broader. So that's why we need to take this much more carefully. So the requirement that we came down to is that at a minimum for preserving privacy, there are 2 things we can do. The first one is I can hide the fact that Femi is the sender of this request, and the discovery provider sees the request, he understands the request is not encrypted, but he doesn't know the identity of the sender of the request. Essentially, you are making the sender anonymous. So that's what the first one does. By hiding the IP address, the username, or other identifying attributes of the sender. But the query is not hidden. It can process the query like regular database lookup, but it doesn't just know who is asking for the query. If you do just that, that is a layer of protection for privacy. Now, the second thing you can do, you don't protect the identity, but you protect the content of the query using crypto. So the server receives the query, it says that Femi is looking up something, but I don't know the particular individual that is of interest to me. So it doesn't see the content, but it can still process the query and return the appropriate mapping back to me. So at a minimum, one of these 2 protection is required for discovery lookups. Daniel?
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So I like what this is doing. I think it's maybe a little bit complicated in how it's saying what it's doing. What we're saying is there's a graph, and I wouldn't say the privacy must be preserved. I would say the discovery provider must know at most one of these 2 things, right? You can't have the discovery provider know both sides of these 2 things, because then the discovery provider gets to learn an edge in the graph, right? So what we're saying is you can leak to the discovery provider the recipient edge or the sender edge, but you can't leak both of them to the discovery provider, right? So when you say the privacy must be preserved, privacy is a contentious word. It's not clear exactly what it means. In this case, what we're saying is the discovery provider must not learn the first bullet or the second bullet. It can learn one or the other, but it can't learn both. So that's sort of the way that I would rephrase it. But I think I like the approach you're taking here. I think this is a good kind of requirement to have.
Yeah.
I would just try to phrase it clearer.
Thank you. Thanks for that feedback. Eric?
Yeah, I would phrase it the same way, roughly the same way DKG did. I think the word discovery provider is actually necessary but not sufficient here. In particular, there's a little bit of question about the MSPs get to learn if they're involved in this process. So I think like this is a little complicated. The sender's MSP eventually will of course learn who you're trying to talk to, most likely, but their recipient's MSP may not necessarily have to learn that. So we made it a little more tweaking than just discovery provider, but I think this is going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Halisa?
Yeah, I liked the way that DKG framed it as well. I also put like a high level framing in the chat, what I understand this to be doing. But I think in particular, the DKG's formulation on like one edge at a time, as opposed to the whole graph, is important because I'm assuming that this is on like a query by query basis. Like in some cases, the identity of the querier might be obfuscated, and in some cases, the content of the query might be obfuscated from the party that we're trying to obfuscate it from. And so I don't want this to be interpreted that it's like for the entire system or for even like a single DP, it's one or the other, because it might depend on whether the querier has identity blinding and protections and whatnot when it's connecting to the DP. So I think this needs to be clear that it's like on a query by query basis.
On a query by query, yeah, I agree. Thank you for that feedback. Any other thoughts on number 7? So let's go to number 8. So number 8 is somewhat privacy. So the essence of number 8 is that should processing discovery requests require federation or cooperation among 2 or more servers, identifying information about senders should not be passed between those servers. So don't overshare. Don't pass the identifier of the client or the IP address or whatever. Don't forward it with requests when you require input from other server in order to process a discovery request. Yeah, Conrad.
Would it make sense to include, can we find a way to include the request target as well? So say there could be a scenario where the DP, you know, I don't know, just making stuff up, but the DP somehow broadcasts, hey, I'm looking for this identifier, and then somehow broadcast that to a bunch of services where half of the servers don't even need to know that. And so kind of maybe we can have this kind of trying to, of course, the DB might have to talk to the MSP, but kind of only, do you know what I'm saying? Kind of limit the way.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That would be a reasonable thing to do in that scenario where you kind of need to broadcast something, but you don't want to overshare. It's kind of consistent with the work you are doing. Certainly it's a good, but we don't want to make a requirement on an architecture that we are not sure whether that is going to land, right? So this is a careful way of saying something. We only pick an edge when instead of as opposed to broadcast, but pick message transmission between 2 servers and saying, identify information about the request origination should not be shared. Now, in particular, for the CSI, it may be hard for us to exclude that because it might be that the recipient might need to know the CSI if we want to be able to answer the query. But we can at least say it shouldn't disclose the identity of the person that originated the query. Yeah.
Yeah, disclose it only like as much as necessary. Although I don't have a good sentence. I'll try to come up with something. But
Yeah.
thanks.
Thanks, correct. Eric?
So, I mean, I don't know this is necessarily bad, but what is it getting us above 7? Because I can try to motivate why I'm a little worried about it, but what's it getting us that 7 didn't already do?
Yeah. So I think we want to preserve that privilege. Let's just say the origin discovery provider, in case we assume there are at least 2 multiple server in this case, that's what this requirement is about. So the origin discovery provider, that is the discovery provider that receives the request, the lookup request, right? So it's a special privilege that it has to be like the entry point to processing discovery query. We don't want it to pass all of those state about the originator of the query that it lends to other discovery providers that it might need their help in processing a query. That is why it's really important. This is a privilege entry point thing that you have. Don't share it. I think that's the essence of it. Yeah.
I don't think I'm quite following. But let me motivate why I'm concerned about this. Say I have a system which, for instance, is fronted by Cloudflare, and so I have a backend server and I have Cloudflare on the front. This would prohibit like sending the source IP address to me, which I don't want, and Cloudflare doesn't want. And so, so I think like just like you're gonna have to find some way to say not something that means entity and not server, because like server is like way too narrow in terms of the way people actually build systems. Like it's really common to have systems like in different like pieces of hardware like that are all operated by one person. And it's a multi-tier system. So I think I guess I can live with this, but if we rewrite it so it's like clear we need an entity and not individual device.
Yeah. So Eric, what's your point? Is it that we don't need this requirement, or?
Well, I would probably strike it, but I guess I'm not willing to fight about it. But but if we're gonna have it, then it has to be like not preclude the case I just described, which is like a perfectly normal service architecture.
Yeah. Like I said, the first entry point to processing a discovery request, that's how that discovery provider is a privileged role. It knows the client that originated the request. We don't want it to pass that state to other discovery provider that might be needed. So it may turn out that a discovery request is only processed by a single server, then this may no longer be a concern. But I think if there ever has to be federation in processing discovery, we absolutely need to ensure this for privacy. Tim?
Thanks. But I think John might want to respond to Ecker, so it would make sense for John to go before me.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, certainly 8 should be no more onerous than 7, right? Like in the sense of, I think we need a phrasing of 8 that just is preserving the property that 7 describes. And in fact, maybe the property of 7 that 7 describes is sufficient that we don't need something that even looks like 8. Does that help Ecker at all? I don't know.
Yes, I mean that's basically what I was advocating for, and so I'm just and so like I would remove 8 because I think 7 is sufficient. But if people really want to have 8, I can live with it as long as it doesn't like ban like these obvious like multi-tier service architecture.
We just say that that 7 extends to cases in which more than one server is involved in resolving a discovery request.
Yep, that's a good compromise. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. So I wanted to respond to the notion Conrad raised about like using broadcasting to sort of obscure which discovery provider is responding to a query. So again, obviously at this stage of discussing requirements, we don't want to get too far into like architectures that solve it and so on. However, I think we should keep in mind that like different participants in this federated discovery story will have different operational capabilities, right? And broadly speaking, maybe I have the wrong intuition, but I think that a given discovery provider would expect to see traffic in some kind of proportion to save a number of mappings that they, I'm not sure I want to say control, but I will. Okay, so what I'm getting at is, if I'm a little participant in this system, I would not want to get like flooded by the volume of requests that are actually going to WhatsApp because somebody is trying to hide the traffic that's actually going there, right? So anyway, as we weigh those kinds of like solutions for hiding traffic, I think we have to keep in mind that we don't want to set an excessively high bar for infrastructure or operational capability here.
Yeah, that's a very good note. I totally agree with that. I think in some of the earlier iteration of the requirement, we kind of we have a requirement that covers that capability of a DP, like what's your throughput? You don't want to overwhelm it with requests. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on 6, 7, and 8 before we move on to the next 3 set of requirements for the discovery provider? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, 2 more. So number 9. So this is pretty straightforward. We basically saying data exchange should be encrypted in transit, and that's it. That's all. Eric?
Is there a reason this doesn't say between servers and servers as well?
Because we don't know if discovery will require server to server.
Okay, but I guess I would just like, maybe you could just remove the phrase between clients and servers, and then we just agree things should always be encrypted in transit. I mean, if we're gonna have it, like I think it's a table stakes, but if we're gonna have this requirement, it should like actually not suggest that it's fine for like DP1 not to encrypt the DP2. That'd be bad news.
Okay, fair point. I agree. We'll remove it. Any other comment? Okay, number 10, last but not the least. So we will have database with mapping. CSI maps to this MSP set and things like that. So this is a very attractive database for spammers and all kind of things. So any discovery provider that aggregates this mapping, we want to make sure that the database is kind of protected against attacks that try to enumerate a significant fraction or all the entries in their database. That's what this requirement is about. Hey, Daniel?
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I like that we're explicitly stating that we're concerned about enumeration attacks. My experience with dealing with this in other protocols, I don't know if it will turn out to be true here, is that defenses against enumeration attacks are almost always partial defenses, or like it's very hard to say that there's an absolute protection against enumeration. It's more about how much cost will it imply, or how much time will it take. And so I don't know how we evaluate a requirement like this if like there's not like a bright line between, oh, this one's protected, you know, this one costs order n time and this one costs order 5n time, therefore is protection? Or do we say it has to be ordered? I don't know that there's a bright line. So I like that it's here. I'm glad we're saying we care about enumeration attacks, but I don't know how you measure this requirement.
Yeah, that's a very solid point. I totally agree, because irrespective of how good a protection is for a sufficiently motivated attackers, it will easily circumvent it. So, but we just want to make it hard for reasonably hard, and it's kind of very difficult to define what that reasonable is. Yeah, I agree with you. Eric?
Yeah, so I guess I'm skeptical of reasonably hard. So, consider a situation where we have a system with, I don't know, roughly 10 to the 10th mappings. And if I'm a provider with 10 to the 8th people, and they each have 10 to the 2nd people in their address book, then I'm going to do 10 to the 10th queries to you. And so, like, I just don't see. I don't see how. I haven't heard a plausible story yet for how you're going to prevent a substantially sized provider from enumerating every record if they want to. And so, yes, if I have 50,000 users, you're going to be really suspicious if I issue 10 to the 10th queries. But if I have 10 to 8th users, it's perfectly normal. And so, I'm trying to understand how this is actually going to work in an environment where we actually have a number of very large gatekeepers who have enormous numbers of users with high numbers of agencies.
Yeah, that's a good so that's a good comment. Yeah, I know this is very hard for sufficiently funded attackers. They will easily enumerate the database. We are not discussing solution, but I mentioned the idea of blind signature. In defeating enumeration, you can rely on watching the target, like at the server where that is being queried, to figure out per request, is this one of those set of query that is bad, that is attempted as enumeration. You can't tell that. What you should rather do, you control it from the client side. One potential approach to do that is to issue each client a blind token that they spent. Maybe I have each day, I have 100 tokens that expires in 24 hours. And those tokens are anonymous in the sense that when I include a token as part of my request, the DP is able to verify that that token has never been spent before, and that token authorizes me to make that request. So at the end of the day, I can only include 100 tokens in a request. So I'm kind of capped out at that. So I think those are promising approaches to limit the volume of requests that can come from a single entity. I'll go to Thibault.
Yes, so two questions. First of all, when you mention a database, what is it? Or who is it? Like, is it like necessarily like the MSP? Is it like who's on it?
No, it's the DP.
Oh, okay.
Discovery provider, yeah.
Okay, so it's like any database from a discovery provider.
Yes.
Okay. And then second question, like asking like similar feeling about like the protection, even with like blinding token, it like means that like, I don't know, as a client, I would authenticate to the DP providers, but like the DP might also need to like authenticate to like fetch the queries, right? Like to fetch the like the final CSI.
To final mapping, you mean? Yeah. We don't know if, okay, we are not trying to assume any architecture for this, but let's look at the two possible cases. Assuming a discovery provider just has a giant database with all the mappings, right? So that means it's able to, it doesn't need to talk to anyone in order to process your query, right? And then there's also a case whereby the DP needs to talk to several other queries to, yeah. In the high, with the concept of blind, with blind signature, any of the providers, they will be able to verify that that token is valid.
But certain DP might do more queries than other DPs, right?
No. So
I mean, the client do request to DPs, and the DP has to fetch.
Yeah, so maybe inter-DP, this is a, because this is a, this discussion is kind of getting into architecture that we're not really talking about there. But if processing a query requires interaction between multiple DPs, inter-DP interaction should not be included in the count, right?
Okay.
The rate
so-
limiting. So it's only
Okay, rate limiting is only to the DP.
on the client, yeah.
Okay.
To the entry point, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. John.
Yeah, this is a really tough one. And I mean, you know, there are a lot of times when we've talked about this and we're like, so what's the difference between taking my entire contact book and like, you know, doing discovery on everything in it, you know, as soon as I like register with a given MSP versus, you know, the cost of that versus just fanning out messages rather than doing discovery at all to like every possible MSP that could be a recipient and like letting the crypto sort out who gets to read them and who doesn't. And like, I mean, honestly, there are versions of this where it's unclear like that there's a, you know, that's much of a trade-off to decide between. But like, yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of confidence actually that like, you know, some kind of token spending system is really gonna handle this because it doesn't indeed address the case that Ecker was speaking to, which is a legitimate one where it's just you're resolving like a profound number of these discovery requests at you know, over a very, very, very short period of time. And you know, it just comes down to how confidential we really believe this stuff is, right? And like, if you're willing to give up on the confidentiality of these mappings overall, then I think that the system becomes a lot easier to wrap your head around. In large part, you know, back when we were talking about mappings being between CSIs and SSIs, we were concerned that that was very sensitive information. I think that arguably the information that merely a CSI maps to something at an MSP is less PII-ish and like, you know, is not that far from just trying to throw over the wall. Well, I should just, rather than doing discovery, like try and see if this works at WhatsApp and like what happens when I do, right? And you know, the fact that you could always do that kind of leads me to believe that the potential enumeration attack has like so many different vectors you could approach it from that like discovery might be the least of our problems. So yeah, I don't know how much value there is in having this as a requirement because it just, you know, I don't know how much value there actually is in trying to protect these mappings, to be blunt.
Yeah,
Yeah, man.
I think I
Go ahead.
agree. Yeah, let me respond to John. I think I agree with John. So yeah, when SSI is being included, that will be considered very sensitive. But now it's just a mapping of CSI to a set of MSP. Or one question about privacy in that is that, am I concerned if somebody learns that I'm reachable on this set of MSPs, or maybe a particular MSP is kind of associated with people with certain lifestyle? Is that revealing? If it's revealing, then I shouldn't include it in my MSP set. So it can be argued either way. Yeah.
But if I just send a message to CSI at that MSP, it'll go through or it won't. Right? I mean, that's the point. Like, so, I mean, this can be revealed through means other than the discovery provider.
Yeah.
Like the discovery provider is not a proxy step between you and sending a message. It's a separate fetch you're doing. And so the fact that you can just like send it to CSI at that MSP, it will still reveal whether there's somebody for that CSI at the MSP.
Yeah. So, well, maybe one advantage for a spammer to get a hold of this database is that now instead of trying the 100 possible messaging service I could use to reach John, I can look at the mapping and oh, John only has, I can only try John on this 5 MSPs. It kind of reduces the work they do instead of spamming all the 100 by some. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth from the point John was making a minute ago. You know, that I do think there's some value in protecting this information, but I think that the value is relatively modest, and I'm very concerned about having it be a requirement that we do so when it seems unclear whether we're able to do so. And the only proposals I've heard would have very substantial impacts on the architecture. For instance, like implying that, like, that every query, the token version you're describing requires every query be somehow bound to a user rather than an MSP, which is like not a requirement we ever assumed previously. So, like, and bound with CSI, right? So I don't know. Like, I'm more than happy to have us try to do this if we have some good ideas. But I think that, like, the purpose of like requirements is like we really have to meet them, and having a requirement which you don't really know how to meet and which has a modest value, it seems to me not the right way to proceed. And if you want to put like really should be, or maybe nice if it were, like, I'd stop fighting about this.
Yeah. I think so assuming, I think the question is, can we establish this is sensitive data that should be protected? That's one thing. And then the second thing is, even if that is the case, we are not quite sure whether this should be part of discovery requirement. Yeah, I do think it's a sensitive database. Yeah, but I'm not sure we can attempt to protect it, but it's just going to be a best effort basis. We can't say done and check and done. Yeah.
This is Daniel. So I do think this can be sensitive. It may not be sensitive for everyone. The fact that the phone number associated with someone who works at Meta has an account at WhatsApp is not particularly surprising or sensitive. One example of a case where this can be sensitive is if we have several MSPs, like 20, then the dimensionality of the space of the MSPs that you are in contact with is a 20-dimensional space, which means that a user who has who is connected to some set of MSPs may be unique. If they have, it's 2 to the 20th here, that's not super unique. But if there's 50 MSPs, then it's a 50-dimensional space. And we're doing a Boolean here, right? Plus tags. Let's forget about tags. But am I connected to this MSP or not? So if I'm connected to a certain set of MSPs, and my device joins the network and then talks to all of those MSPs, then that may be a fingerprint for that particular user. So if we're talking about 4 MSPs globally, this is not sensitive information because everyone's going to be on one of the anonymity set is 1/16, right? But as the number of MSPs gets larger, the anonymity set sets get much smaller. And that's why this is potentially sensitive. I don't know how to defend against it, but I'm just trying to give you a justification for what's the intuition for why this could be sensitive.
Yeah, I agree totally. Yeah, I think it is. So now we have one more hand in the room. I totally agree with Daniel. This is sensitive data.
Just to directly respond to that, isn't that already the case today when I connect with my email client to 5 different email accounts? Because there's like 100 or 1,000 email providers out there, and I connect to 5 to them. That would be the same kind of fingerprint you're talking about. And the same is true when I go to my web browser. I'm going to 5 different news sites or 5 sites that I care about, and that is already a fingerprint. And you're going to say that somebody is already fingerprinting that today, and that's true. But that train, what I'm saying is that train has left.
And this ties that fingerprint back to a CSI.
That's the point.
Yeah.
John Peterson, that's the point I was going to make. I mean, remember the input to this process is the CSI. In the sense of it's already a PII who identifies effectively who these mappings are about. Like I'm not sure I follow you or that this is analogous in any way, because the thing you are querying for is the CSI, and when you get back the set of mapping data, I mean, you can do reverse, reverse CNA, as you used to say in the old days, on the telephone number and find out whose telephone number it is. That's like actually really public information, unfortunately.
I was giving an explanation for why enumeration is sensitive, right? So if
It's allowing to target who you are because the CSI targets who you are already.
right, and enumeration is where I don't know the CSI. What I've done is I've gathered what the fingerprints are. I don't know the CSIs in advance. And if I am capable of enumerating, then I can see I have a table of fingerprints that I can map to CSIs. It's a reverse.
The mapping contains the CSI. When you download 5 mappings, when you download 100 million mappings, you can say all the ones that have this CSI in them, let's take those out. You want to know who that is? Do reverse CNN, the CSI, because like that'll tell you that it's John Peterson. Like you don't need to go look at what like messaging services I'm connected to be able to figure out for a telephone number who I am, unfortunately. But you could do that for everyone in this entire list. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
but you could do that if you found any one record that had a CSI, and you could go look up who that is. We're talking past each other, I think. But like, what do you think you can find out about somebody from having the mappings that you can't find out from just having a phone number?
If you start from the network fingerprint, then you don't have the phone number. And if I can do an enumeration, I can go from the network fingerprint to a phone number.
Okay, so you're not talking about database contents, you're talking about the access to the database.
We're talking about discovery provider requirement 10, right here, which says that the database must be protected against enumeration attacks. And my argument is that the reason you should have an intuition that enumeration is sensitive is because in a high dimensionality MSP space, the enumeration permits mapping from a network fingerprint to a CSI.
See if I understand Daniel's argument here.
Okay.
DKG, is your suggestion, for instance, that that I'm on the IETF network review and I see a given IP address connects to the following 8 different MSPs, and then I go and I look in the database and I'm like, the only guy who connects exactly those 8 MSPs, no others, is John. Is this phone number? And then I go back to that from John. Is that the kind of attack you're concerned about?
Okay.
I'm not saying it's great. I'm trying to like work through what it
I
might
mean,
be.
because I read this requirement completely differently. I read this requirement to be enumeration as in I can extract a substantial amount of the database and like go analyze it to figure out things about people. Not that I'm looking at external network traffic that's associated with this. So there may be 2 separate requirements we want to talk about. One requirement that's derived completely from what you can figure out if you just have access to all or a substantial portion of the records without any network traffic whatsoever. Just like you can find it on paper on the ground, right? Like, and there's things you can do with that I would consider to be an enumeration attack. But it sounds like you're more concerned about like observing traffic that is going to discovery providers. This is just talking about the database itself, I think, rather than any traffic going to and from the database.
Let me clarify one thought. Yeah. Daniel, you can talk after. So the way I interpreted what you said is that each user as a user, I establish a mapping that shows that my telephone number maps to these 3 set or this 5 set of MSPs, right? Maybe some other user, their set may be as large as 20 or 50, or some user that they have like very extremely large, maybe 75 MSP that they are reachable on. So my understanding is that those users with very high number, they are like not very common.
That's not the argument I was making. My argument was if you have 20 MSPs and the frequency of use of those MSPs is different, it's not the people who connect to the most MSPs that are vulnerable. It's the people who connect to a unique set of MSPs. So I might only connect to 3 MSPs, but if I'm the only person who connects to those 3, then I stand out. And John, in answer to your question about whether this is about the sensitivity of this data set in isolation from all other information in the universe, or whether this is about whether this is sensitive because of its relationship to other data in the universe. If there was no other information in the universe, then I wouldn't care about this data set. It wouldn't be meaningful to me. Privacy is a contextual thing. So when we talk about the privacy relationships, it's because of how this provides additional linkages to other things that exist in the world. And network fingerprints, as Ben said, are a thing that exists in the world that people do track. So that's why this is a sensitive thing, is because of how it relates to other data sets that we know are visible and gathered.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Conrad?
I just wanted to come here to support Daniel on this argument that this information is certainly sensitive. And I don't think you have to go as far as a 20-dimensional space and the possibility for fingerprinting, but just the choice of MSP that you have. And I, without wanting to get political here, but there was a couple of years ago a crackdown in Turkey where a group of people was associated with a certain MSP, and people who were a certain app was found on the phone, they're immediately considered complicit. And so if that database is extracted, then you have a nice list of mappings between phone numbers and MSPs, and that might be not what we want.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Just
yeah,
DKG, I tried to capture some of this. You're gonna have to take a look at it.
okay, thank you. Yeah, so the point is, privacy is an individual perspective, and we want to take it, make it a priority, even though a tiny fraction of user is really concerned about this. So maybe for majority of you, oh, this is not sensitive, but just a tiny fraction, they think this is concerning from a privacy perspective. We want to take it as important. We really want to protect that. So we know this is an important requirement. The question now is, do we want to make it a requirement as part of discovery or not? Or should we leave that to individual implementations? I know there are differing opinions that maybe just because we know this is important, but because it's just too hard, we can't really tell when we've done it. Maybe we shouldn't make something a requirement that we cannot fulfill. Is that the only argument?
I mean, so the point I was trying to make about this actual text was that, being able to get the contents of the database, I was arguing there are sensitivity implications of that are different from what DKG was talking about. I'm not sure this is written is super useful. Something that was actually referring to like network traffic or something might be super useful. But like as written, I'm not sure how private this practically is, or that it provides like any discernible privacy property. Like there's another way to write this that is talking about what DKG is talking about that might actually provide that.
Yeah, I think we should strike this for the reason roughly you indicated. I don't think we really know how to do it, and we're not going to know when we got it. I think if people think it's important, I mean, the first requirements documents to constrain the design space, and if we're not sure we can meet it, that doesn't help us constrain the design space very well. I think if people feel like I still have a position in terms of the importance somewhere between, I think, John and DKG, which is I think it would be nice to do this. And I think if we have a good way to do it, we should do it. But I think if we do not have a good way to do it, we should not do it. And we should not stop the entire project until we figure out how to do it. And that's what a requirement would mean in this case. And so if people want to like write something that like has a softer word here than must, then I'm more than happy to have that text in here. But I think the must is actually going to harm us, not help us. So, so like I say, I think if we want to have like exhortational text in here that says like one ought to do this, that sounds great to me. If we want to have, but I think that the must is going to harm the project. So that's my put on this.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Ben?
One speaker said made the point that this is unclear, this requirement. I would agree. I read it the same way, that it's an attack against a MSP. So maybe adding who is attacking what exactly would be very helpful to stay, and in which situation is it external, or that would be very helpful to clarify.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, sorry that this is a little bit abstract. We just try. One of the feedback we got from the group previously is requirements should not assign role to specific identity. That is why we try to write the requirement by not assigning role, just taking a very high level approach to that. And that removes a lot of clarity and questions and raises questions. Yeah, but that's a good feedback. Thanks. One more.
Yeah, this is DKG. I know that I've said that this is sensitive data and that I want defense against enumeration to be something that we consider. But I actually agree with Eric that this is better off as a should than a must because of what I said at the first, which is we don't know how to measure this. We don't know how to draw the line on whether this is successful or not. So keep the enumeration attacks in mind. You know, do what you can to mitigate them. But if we make it a must, I don't even know how I would ever say that we did succeed. I just don't. I don't know how that's.
I agree with that. It should be a should. Yeah, I think we should call it out and not make it a must. I think that's where I think we're landing. Yeah. Okay. Any last comment? How are we doing on time?
You're fine. We have 30 minutes left in the session.
Yes, way to go. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it. We've reframed the requirement into short 10 sweet requirement. And thanks everyone for your engagement, a lot of feedback, a lot of discussion. And we'll take that back and kind of tweak the 10 requirements some more to address all the comment we have in this session. And that's it. So like I said, thank you, Eric, for corresponding with me, multiple email chains offline to help us get here. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Femi. Really appreciate you are persisting through for an hour and a half of that. So we have an open call for adoption on this draft on the mailing list. And I think, you know, a lot of the conversation today and the back and forth on the list will address a bunch of the comments that were already flagged. Would be great to spin a new version and everyone else can kind of evaluate the adoption call on the basis of the new version. And the folks who have already submitted comments, once you see that, if you could reconfirm on the list whether your comments were addressed and whether you support adoption, that would be very useful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll cut a new version of the draft. Yeah.
Great. And I think Richard had comments too. I guess he's not here, but he should follow up. And if he doesn't follow up, the chairs will follow up with him too to get him to close out his piece. So I think that's all we had. Does anybody have anything else they wanted to talk about before we close out? Oh, right. Tim, you wanted to talk about interims. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So thus far, or I don't know, since the last 2 or 3 IETFs, we've been doing interims every 2 weeks, which I think have been, well, I don't know, my feeling is that they've been productive. We've canceled them when nothing has come up. So anyways, wanted to ask the room, do we want to do more interims? 1, don't go away, Rowan. And 2, how do we feel about the cadence? Is every 2 weeks sufficient? Do we want them more often, less often?
Hi, sorry, I don't have I'm reloading here, but I don't want to do any more often than every 2 weeks. And I think if we do every 2 weeks, we can still cancel if we don't have agenda items.
Yeah, it does seem like that's been working fine so far. Go ahead, Rafael.
Yeah, just confirming what Ron said. 2 weeks is really a maximum at this point.
Okay, then in that case, I'm going to take that to the list just to give everybody a chance to chime in. But absent, any other strong objection, we'll schedule more every 2 weekly interims. Besides that, watch out for an adoption call on the list, confirming the show of hands we had earlier today for the room policy draft. Yeah, and hopefully we'll, as Alyssa just laid out, we'll see an adoption call for the next draft of discovery requirements. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Yeah, just on the room policy, Ori, I submitted new milestones for that. So we'll do the adoption call pending those new milestones.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so there's, go ahead, Rowan.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you to the chairs for getting up very, very early in the morning. I appreciate you.
Yes, thank you, chairs.
Okay, looks like everybody's raring to get out of the room, but we officially have 26 minutes left on the clock. So anything maybe anybody wants to talk about, feel free to come to the mic and speak your mind.
Really?
See ya.
Thank you to the note takers. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye all.
Would I be right to ask some general questions because I'm new?
Sorry, say your name.
Will Earp, sorry.
You have a question you want to ask?
Would I be right to ask some general questions because I'm new to the project? Or should I just talk to you after it?
Why don't we'll just take it offline in the corner?